The flashing red and blue lights cut through the night as a patrol car pulls up behind a sleek black SUV. A cop, stiff with authority, steps out, adjusting his belt as he approaches the driver's side. Inside the vehicle sits a man in full military uniform, badges glistening under the streetlights, a name tag that commands respect. But none of that seems to matter. The officer taps the window, his face unreadable. "License and registration," he demands. His voice carries the weight of assumption, the kind that makes a man's blood run cold. The driver calmly obliges, handing over his ID. The officer barely glances at it before narrowing his eyes. "Step out of the vehicle," he orders. The man exhales slowly, his years of discipline keeping him composed. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asks. But there is no answer, just suspicion. The officer places a hand on his holster, and within seconds, the situation spirals. The general, a man who has served his country with honor, finds himself in handcuffs, forced to kneel on the pavement like a common criminal. Then, with steady hands, he reaches for his phone. One call. That's all it takes. And when the Pentagon answers, the officer's face drains of color. What happens next will leave everyone speechless. The officer watches as the man dials, his hands still cuffed behind his back. The general's voice remains steady, controlled, but there's an unmistakable edge to it. Whoever is on the other end of that call doesn't need a long explanation. Within seconds, the tone shifts. The cop notices it too. His grip on the radio tightens, and for the first time that night, uncertainty flickers across his face. The general doesn't shout. He doesn't argue. He simply states his name, his rank, and a single directive. The response is immediate. The officer catches bits and pieces, words like Pentagon, chain of command, and a name he doesn't recognize but instinctively knows carries weight. A sinking feeling settles in the pit of his stomach. This isn't just another traffic stop. This isn't a routine arrest. A second patrol car pulls up. Another officer steps out, but before he can even assess the situation, a sharp order comes through the radio. The first officer stiffens, his jaw tightening. The voice on the other end isn't asking, it's demanding. The street suddenly feels too quiet. The general doesn't move, doesn't say another word. He's just waiting, watching. And then in the distance, the sound of approaching sirens cuts through the tension. Something big is about to happen. The officer shifts uncomfortably, gripping his belt as the radio crackles again. This time, the voice is sharper, more urgent. "Stand down, immediately." His throat goes dry. He glances at the general, who remains calm, unmoved, as if he already knows how this will end. The flashing lights of the second patrol car paint streaks across his uniform, but he doesn't flinch. He's been in situations far worse than this. The second officer steps forward, confusion in his eyes. "What's going on here?" he asks, scanning between the handcuffed general and his partner, who suddenly looks like he's seen a ghost. He wasn't complying. The first officer stammers. The general exhales, shaking his head slightly. "I complied. You just didn't like my answer." Silence. Then more sirens. But these aren't regular patrol cars. The low, powerful rumble of an unmarked SUV rolls to a stop at the scene. The doors swing open, and out step two men in suits, their expressions unreadable. The first officer swallows hard. Who are you?" One of the men pulls out a badge, one that doesn't belong to local law enforcement. "You've made a mistake," he says simply. Then, looking at the general, he adds, "A very big one." The air grows heavier. The general remains still, but the weight of what's happening presses down on everyone else. Something far bigger than a traffic stop is unfolding, and no one on that street is ready for what comes next. The first officer takes a step back, his pulse pounding in his ears. He's trained for intense situations, but this is something else. His mind races, replaying every decision he made in the last 10 minutes. The handcuffs, the forced arrest, the way he ignored the ID in his hand. And now, standing in front of him, are men who outrank anyone he's ever dealt with. One of the suited men locks eyes with him. "Take off the cuffs, now." The officer hesitates, but a single glance at his partner, who looks just as uneasy, tells him he has no choice. With shaky hands, he pulls out the key and unlocks the restraints. The metal clicks open, and the general slowly rubs his wrists, his expression unreadable. He doesn't lash out. He doesn't demand anything. He just watches. Then, another vehicle arrives. This time, it's a black sedan with tinted windows. It glides to a stop, the quiet hum of its engine the only sound in the tense night air. The door opens, and a man steps out, his posture sharp, his presence commanding. The officer doesn't recognize him, but the general does. His lips press into a thin line. "You really didn't think this through, did you?" the man says, shaking his head as he steps closer. The officer swallows hard. The weight of his actions is crashing down all at once. He's no longer in control, and as more figures emerge from the darkness, he realizes something that makes his stomach drop. This is no longer just about him, the general, or even this one night. Something much bigger is at play, and whatever happens next, there's no undoing it. The officer's mouth goes dry as a man from the black sedan steps forward, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the pavement. There's an eerie calm about him, like someone who already knows the ending to a story everyone else is still trying to piece together. He doesn't acknowledge the officer at first. Instead, his sharp gaze locks onto the general. "Are you all right, sir?" he asks, his tone respectful but laced with urgency. The general nods slowly, flexing his wrists where the cuffs had been. "I'm fine," he replies, but there's a weight to his voice. A warning. Then finally, the man turns to the officer, his expression unreadable. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" The officer stammers, searching for the right words, but none come. His training, his authority, none of it matters in this moment. The presence of these men, the unmarked cars, the radio silence from his department, it all adds up to one terrifying realization. He's not the one in charge anymore. But before anyone can speak, another voice cuts through the tension. "Sir, we have a problem." One of the suited men steps away from his phone, his expression grim. He whispers something to the man from the sedan, who immediately stiffens. The general notices the shift too. His calm demeanor fades just slightly, a flicker of something more serious flashing across his face. The officer watches, his heart pounding. He doesn't know what was just said, but whatever it was, it changed everything. And suddenly, the general isn't the only one in trouble. Something much larger is unfolding, something that none of them saw coming. The air is thick with tension as the suited man lowers his phone, his face unreadable. He takes a slow breath before stepping closer to the general, lowering his voice. "Sir, it's worse than we thought." The general's expression hardens. "Explain." The officer watches, his pulse racing. He should walk away, step back, but his feet are glued to the pavement. Whatever is happening, he's in too deep now. The suited man glances at him for a moment, then back to the general. "The call you made. Someone tried to block it." The general's jaw tightens. "Who?" A long silence. Then the man finally speaks. It came from inside the Pentagon. The words hit like a thunderclap. Even the officer, who barely understands the weight of the situation, feels the shift. This isn't just about a wrongful arrest. It's bigger, much bigger. The officer looks at the general, realization dawning. He wasn't just any high-ranking military man. He was a target. Someone wanted him out of the way. And this stop, this so-called routine traffic incident, was no accident. The general straightens, his mind already working. We need to move. Now. Before the officer can process what's happening, the black sedan's back door swings open. "Get in," the suited man orders. For a moment, the officer thinks they're talking to him. But then, to his horror, the general steps forward. He doesn't resist. He doesn't hesitate. He just gets in. The door slams shut. The suited man turns to the officer one last time. Forget this ever happened. And then, just like that, the car speeds off into the night, leaving nothing but flashing lights and unanswered questions behind. The officer stands frozen, the sound of the black sedan fading into the night. His mind is spinning, but deep down, he knows one thing for sure. He was just a small piece of something far bigger than himself. This wasn't about a traffic stop. It wasn't even about him. It was a power play, something happening at levels far above his pay grade. And now, the man he had wrongfully arrested was gone, taken somewhere he'd never know. His radio crackles, snapping him out of his thoughts. Unit 14, status update. The familiar voice of dispatch feels distant, almost meaningless now. He glances at his partner, who looks just as shaken. For the first time in his career, he doesn't know what to say. Everything's clear, he finally mutters.